Now, I've rarely shared this argument in a public lecture before, not because I think it's unsound, but because it's so abstract that students are apt to think that it's either a trick or else that they just don't understand it. But tonight I'm going to go out on a limb and share it with you. Now, in order to understand this argument, you first need to understand what philosophers mean by possible worlds. A possible world is just a way the world might have been. It's a complete description of reality. So a possible world is not a planet or a universe or any kind of concrete object. It's just a world description. The actual world is the description that is true. Other possible worlds are descriptions that might have been true, but are not in fact true. To say that something exists in some possible world is to say that there is some description of reality which includes that entity. To say that something exists in every possible world is to say that no matter which description is true, the entity will be included in that description. So, for example, unicorns do not in fact exist, but there is some possible world in which unicorns exist. On the other hand, many mathematicians think that numbers exist in every possible world. They exist necessarily. Now, with that background in mind, consider the ontological argument, which was discovered in 1011 by the monk Anselm of Canterbury. God, says Anselm, is by definition the greatest being conceivable. If you could conceive of anything greater than God, then that would be God. So, by definition, God is the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So, what would such a being be like? Well, he would be all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, and he would exist in every logically possible world. A being which lacked any of those properties would not be maximally great. We could conceive of something even greater. But what that implies is that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. For if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, it exists in all of them. That's part of what it means to be maximally great, to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good in every logically possible world. So, if God's existence is even possible, he exists in every logically possible world, and therefore in the actual world. Now, we can summarize this argument as follows. Number one, it's possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists. Two, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Three, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. Four, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Five, therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. Six, therefore, a maximally great being exists. Seven, therefore, God exists. Now, it might surprise you to learn that steps 2 through 7 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers agree that if God's existence is even possible, then he must exist. So the whole question is premise 1. Is God's existence possible? Well, what do you think? The atheist has to maintain that it's impossible that God exists. He has to say that the concept of God is logically incoherent, like the idea of a married bachelor or a round square. But the problem is that the concept of God just doesn't appear to be incoherent in that way. The idea of a being which is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good in every logically possible world seems perfectly coherent. Moreover, as we've seen, there are other arguments for God's existence which at least suggest that it's logically possible that God exists. So, I'll simply leave it to you tonight. Do you think that it's possible that God exists? If you do, then it follows logically that God does exist.